The galaxy had been quiet for a very long time. 400 years of peace had made the great civilization soft, comfortable, and completely unprepared for what was coming. The Vaylari, a tall and thin species with silver skin and wide dark eyes, had built the Galactic Coalition from nothing. They were diplomats, thinkers, and dreamers. They believed that violence was a sickness that intelligent species would eventually outgrow. Their fleets were designed to carry grain and medicine, not weapons. Their soldiers had not fired a shot in anger for 3 generations. They had forgotten what war truly looked like. They were about to remember. It started at the edge of known space, in a small cluster of farming colonies orbiting a yellow star called Valnus. The colonies were peaceful places where Vaylari families grew crops and raised their children far from the noise of the capital. On a calm evening, a young farmer looked up at the sky and saw something that made his blood go cold. The stars were disappearing. One by one, the points of light in the sky were going dark, blocked out by something enormous moving across the void. The Krethen had arrived. They came in numbers that made no sense. Thousands of ships, each one a living thing made of bone and dark flesh, poured out of the black space beyond the outer rim like a river of insects. They did not send a message. They did not make demands. They simply began to destroy everything in their path. The farming colonies were gone within hours. The orbital stations were torn apart. The cargo ships tried to run, but the Krethen were faster. Distress signals lit up across every frequency, and then, one by one, they went silent. The Vaylari High Council gathered on Thesara, their capital world. The council chamber was a beautiful room made of white stone and living crystal, designed to echo with the sound of calm debate. But there was no calm now. Ambassador Lorath, the eldest member of the council, stood at the center and listened to the reports coming in from every corner of Coalition space. 6 border colonies had gone dark. 2 fleets sent to investigate had been completely destroyed. The Krethen hive was not slowing down. It was growing. Lorath had lived for over 200 years. He had seen droughts, plagues, and political crises. But he had never seen anything like this. The Coalition had no real military. Their weapons were outdated. Their people had no training for this kind of violence. Every species in the Coalition had evolved on gentle worlds with mild weather, low gravity, and few predators. They had never needed to fight to survive. But Lorath knew of one species that had. Deep in the restricted archives of the Coalition, there was a file marked with the highest level of warning. It described a species from a small, dangerous world orbiting an ordinary star. The world was called Earth, and it was classified as a Deathworld, the most dangerous category in the Galactic Survey. Earth had crushing gravity, a toxic atmosphere filled with corrosive oxygen, extreme temperature swings, and an ecosystem so violent that nearly every living thing on its surface had evolved to either kill or avoid being killed. And somehow, against all reason, this world had produced an intelligent species. The humans. The Coalition had made contact with them over a century ago, and had immediately decided to keep them at a distance. The humans were terrifying. They were dense, heavy creatures, with bones like stone and muscles that could crush metal. They ate the flesh of other animals. Their history was an endless record of wars, famines, and disasters, and yet they had not only survived, but thrived. They had crawled out of their deadly world and into space with ships built from raw aggression and stubborn refusal to die. The Coalition had quietly placed a quarantine around their system, and hoped they would stay there. Now Lorath stood before the council and suggested the unthinkable. He wanted to call the humans for help. The chamber erupted. Council members shouted that it was madness, Bringing humans into coalition space would be like releasing a predator into a nursery. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and violent by nature. But Lorath raised his hand, and the room fell silent. He told them very quietly that the Crethon had already killed more people in 6 days than any disaster in coalition history. He told them that every fleet they had sent had been destroyed. He told them that if they did not find help, the hive would reach Thessara within 10 days, and there would be nothing left of any of them. The vote passed by a narrow margin, and the signal was sent. On Earth, it was a Tuesday afternoon in the Nevada desert. Colonel Danny Cole was sitting in a metal chair inside a listening post buried 50 feet underground, drinking bad coffee and watching data scroll across a screen. Danny was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, with short brown hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from rough wood. He had spent 20 years in the military and had been assigned to the Deep Space Listening Program because someone high up thought it was important to keep an ear on the galaxy, even though the aliens had made it very clear they wanted nothing to do with humanity. The signal came through at 3:47 in the afternoon. It was messy, broken, and filled with static, but Danny knew immediately that it was real. He had listened to thousands of hours of dead air, and this was different. There was something in the signal that went beyond language. It was raw, desperate fear. He picked up the phone and made a call. 3 hours later, General Nate Bishop walked into a briefing room at the United Nations Joint Defense Command. Nate was a tall, lean man with gray at his temples and calm gray eyes that never seemed to blink. He had commanded Earth's Deep Space Rapid Response Division for 5 years, a force that had been built in secret for exactly this kind of moment. Beside him sat Dr. Laura Kim, the chief xenolinguist, a small woman with sharp features and glasses that she constantly pushed up her nose. Laura had spent the last 2 hours decoding the alien transmission, and what she had found made her hands shake. She told the room that the signal was from the Velari, the species that had placed the quarantine on Earth. She told them that something was attacking their civilization. Something big and fast, and completely without mercy. She told them that the Velari were not asking for supplies, advice, or technology. They were asking for soldiers. They were asking for the one thing that humans had always been better at than anyone else in the galaxy. They were asking for war. Nate Bishop sat quietly for a long moment after Laura finished speaking. He looked around the room at the faces of his officers. Some of them looked nervous. Some of them looked excited. All of them understood what this meant. Humanity had spent a century being treated like a dangerous animal, locked behind a fence and told to stay quiet. Now the galaxy was on fire, and the people who had locked the fence were begging the animal to come out. Nate stood up and said 2 words that would change the history of the galaxy. Earth moved fast. That was the thing about humans that the galaxy had never truly understood. They were not just strong and violent. They were fast. Not in the way a predator is fast, chasing down a single piece of prey. They were fast in the way a storm is fast, building from nothing into something massive before anyone had time to react. Within 12 hours of Nate Bishop giving the order, the Deep Space Rapid Response Division was fully activated. Ships that had been sitting in hidden orbital docks above the dark side of the moon powered up their engines for the first time in years. Crews were pulled from bases on 3 continents. Weapons that had been designed, built, and tested in secret were loaded into armored holds. The whole operation moved with a kind of terrifying efficiency that came from decades of preparation and centuries of practice at getting ready for a fight. The battle group consisted of 9 warships. They were not elegant. They were not beautiful. They were thick, angular, ugly machines made of reinforced steel and ceramic armor, painted in flat gray and covered in weapon ports. The largest of them was the heavy cruiser Iron Promise, a ship that looked less like a vessel and more like a fist. Her captain was Chris Dunn, a stocky man of 38, with a shaved head and a quiet voice that somehow carried across any room. Chris had never seen real combat. None of them had. But he had trained for it every single day of his career. And when the order came, he felt something settle into place inside his chest, like a key turning in a lock. The wormhole jump was rough. The Velari had sent coordinates for a temporary passage through folded space, and Earth's engineers had rigged a gate in record time. The ships punched through one by one, shaking and groaning under forces that would have torn a coalition vessel apart. When they came out the other side, they were in Velari space, 3 systems away from Thesara. A Velari diplomatic shuttle was waiting for them. The first meeting between humans and coalition species in over a century happened in the main hangar of the Iron Promise. Chris Dunn had ordered the space cleaned up and the lights turned to a softer setting, hoping it might make the aliens feel more comfortable. It did not work. The Velari delegation stepped off their shuttle and immediately froze. The air inside the human ship was thick, warm, and smelled of metal and cleaning chemicals. The gravity was almost twice what they were used to. The Velari leader, a diplomat named Thessa, felt her knees buckle the moment she stepped onto the deck. 2 of her aides had to hold her upright. Then the humans came to greet them, and things got worse. Lieutenant Meg Lawson had been assigned as the escort for the delegation. She was a Marine platoon leader, 29 years old, with red hair pulled back in a tight bun, and a jaw that looked like it could take a punch from a freight train. She walked toward the Velari with what she thought was a friendly smile. The Velari saw a muscular predator baring its teeth at them and nearly ran back to their shuttle. It took Dr. Laura Kim almost 20 minutes to calm the delegation down. Laura spoke softly, moved slowly, and kept her hands visible at all times, treating the aliens the way a person might approach a frightened animal. She explained that humans meant them no harm, that the smile was a gesture of friendship, and that the heaviness they felt was simply normal gravity for Earth. The Velari listened with wide, terrified eyes. Thessa eventually found her voice. She told the humans that the Crethon had taken 11 colony worlds and were moving toward the inner systems. Coalition losses were in the billions. Every fleet sent against the Hive had been destroyed in minutes. The Crethon did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners. They consumed everything in their path and moved on. Laura translated this for Nate Bishop, who had arrived on a command vessel behind the main group. Nate listened without expression, then asked to see all available tactical data on the enemy. What the Velari showed him was deeply troubling. The Crethon were a hive species. Each individual was a large insectoid creature, roughly the size of a horse, with armored plates, multiple limbs, and jaws that could bite through metal. They had no technology in the traditional sense. Their ships were grown, not built. Massive living organisms that traveled through space like whales through an ocean. Their weapons were biological, spraying jets of acid that could melt through hull plating. The main Hive fleet was estimated at over 50,000 vessels, carrying billions of warriors. But the most dangerous thing about them was their coordination. Every Crethon was connected to a central intelligence, the Hive Queen, who directed their movements like a single vast mind controlling billions of bodies. They did not feel fear. They did not retreat. They simply kept coming until everything in front of them was dead. Nate studied the data for a long time. He asked Laura to pull up everything she could find about the Hive Queen, her location, and how the communication network functioned. Then he turned to Chris Dunn and told him to take the Iron Promise and 3 escort frigates to the front line. The Crethon Vanguard fleet was 4 days away from Thesara. Chris needed to slow them down, buy time, make them bleed. Chris nodded and left without a word. Meanwhile, on Thesara itself, Meg Lawson was given a different kind of mission. Nate wanted ground defenses built around the capital city, and he wanted coalition volunteers trained to fight alongside the human Marines. Meg took a shuttle down to the surface and got her first look at the Velari homeworld. It was beautiful. The capital city was a sprawling collection of white towers and gardens built along the banks of a wide, slow river. The air was thin and sweet, the gravity was gentle, and the light from the twin suns gave everything a soft golden glow. It looked like paradise. Meg understood immediately why these people had never learned to fight. They had never needed to. She set up a training ground in a park near the city center, and began working with the coalition volunteers. Most of them were Velari, though there were a few members of other species as well. They were eager and brave, but they had no idea what they were doing. They held weapons like they were afraid the guns might bite them. They flinched at loud noises. They had never thrown a punch, never been hit, never felt the shock of real physical violence. A young Velari named Sorath approached Meg after the first training session. He was tall, even by Velari standards, with long silver fingers and a gentle face that reminded Meg of a deer. He asked her a question that Laura later translated for her. How do your people run toward death instead of away from it? Meg thought about that for a while. She sat down on the grass and looked up at the golden sky and tried to find an answer that would make sense to someone who had never known a world where everything was trying to kill you. She told him that on Earth, fear was not something you could escape. It was in the air, in the water, in the ground beneath your feet. Every creature on Earth lived with the constant knowledge that something bigger, faster, or meaner was out there, waiting. They had evolved to be afraid and to keep moving anyway. Fear doesn't go away, she said. We just learn to move faster than it does. Sorath stared at her for a long time. Then he picked up his weapon, held it a little tighter, and walked back to the training line. Above them, in the cold darkness of space, the Iron Promise and her escorts were burning hard toward the front line. Chris Dunn stood on his bridge and watched the stars stretch into lines as the ship accelerated. Somewhere ahead of him, a swarm of alien monsters was eating its way through civilization after civilization, and he was flying straight into its teeth. He was afraid. Every human on every ship was afraid. But they had been afraid before, many times, across thousands of years of bloody history, and they had always gone forward anyway. That was what made them dangerous. The Sauron system was a dead place. 3 rocky planets orbited a dim red star, surrounded by a dense asteroid belt that had once been a 4th planet torn apart by gravity millions of years ago. There was nothing alive here, nothing worth protecting, and that was exactly why Chris Dunn chose it. He did not want to fight the Crethon near anything that could be destroyed. He wanted open space, hard cover from the asteroids, and room to be violent without worrying about who might get hurt. The Iron Promise and her 3 escort frigates, the Blackhawk, the Copperhead, and the Sawtooth, dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the asteroid belt and went dark. They cut their engines, powered down every system that gave off a signal, and drifted in the shadow of a massive rock the size of a small city. Then they waited. Chris stood on the bridge of the Iron Promise and stared at the tactical display. The Crethon Vanguard fleet was a cloud of red dots moving steadily through the system. Roughly 600 vessels ranging in size, from small drones no bigger than a car to massive carrier organisms nearly a kilometer long. The carriers were the key. Each one held thousands of warrior-cast Crethon and dozens of smaller attack ships inside its body, ready to be released like seeds from a rotting fruit. The coalition observers who had been assigned to the human fleet watched the display with open horror. A Velari officer named Rel stood at the back of the bridge, his silver skin pale with fear. He told Chris, through Laura Kim's translation over the comm channel, that the standard coalition response to a fleet this size would be to engage at maximum range with guided energy weapons, and retreat if the enemy closed the distance. Chris listened politely, and then told Rel that the humans would not be doing that. He gave the order at 0300 hours, ship time. All 4 human vessels lit their engines at the same moment, and drove straight into the heart of the Crethon formation at full speed. The aliens on the bridge could not believe what they were seeing. The human ships were not keeping their distance. They were not firing from safety. They were charging directly into the swarm, like wolves leaping into a herd. Rel gripped the railing so hard his fingers cracked. The first minutes were chaos. The Crethon reacted instantly, sending waves of small drone ships forward to intercept. The drones were fast, agile, and coated in a biological armor that could absorb light energy weapons. But the humans were not using energy weapons. The Iron Promise opened fire with kinetic cannons, massive guns that hurled solid slugs of tungsten at incredible speed. The slugs did not care about biological armor. They punched through the drones like stones through wet paper, each impact sending shattered pieces of alien flesh spinning into the void. The frigates spread out in a wide formation, their point defense systems filling the space around them with a storm of smaller projectiles that shredded anything that came close. The Crethon drones died by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The empty space between the asteroids became a graveyard of broken alien bodies and drifting clouds of dark fluid. But the Crethon did not stop. They never stopped. More drones poured out of the carriers, replacing the dead ones faster than the humans could kill them. Acid projectiles began to hit the human ships, sizzling against the ceramic armor and leaving smoking craters in the hull. The Copperhead took a direct hit to her port engine and began to list to one side, trailing sparks and atmosphere. Chris Dunn made a decision that would have been considered insane by any other species in the galaxy. He ordered the Iron Promise to ram the nearest carrier. The heavy cruiser accelerated to full speed and hit the Crethon carrier head-on. The reinforced prow of the Iron Promise, a solid wedge of layered steel and titanium designed for exactly this purpose, split the carrier open like an axe through a log. The impact threw everyone on the bridge off their feet. Alarms screamed, lights flickered, but the ship held together, and the carrier broke apart around them, spilling its cargo of warriors into space, where they died in the vacuum. Rel, who had been thrown against a wall by the impact, stared at Chris with an expression that was equal parts terror and awe. He asked, in a shaking voice, if the humans had really designed their ship to be used as a battering ram. Chris wiped blood from a cut on his forehead and said yes. While the fleet battle raged, Sergeant Jake Perry was leading a boarding team through the wreckage of a second carrier that had been crippled by the Sawtooth's guns. Jake was a compact, dark-haired man from a small town in Kentucky. He had a quiet way about him that made people think he was shy, right up until the moment he kicked in a door and started shooting. The inside of the Crethon carrier was a nightmare. The corridors were not built. They were grown, made of the same dark biological material as the outer hull. The walls were warm and wet and pulsed slightly, like the inside of a living body. The air was thick with a chemical smell that burned the eyes and throat, and the gravity was uneven, shifting with every step as the dying ship twisted in space. Jake's team moved through the corridors in a tight formation, their weapons up and their helmet lights cutting through the gloom. They found the first Crethon warriors in a wide chamber deep inside the ship. The creatures were big, much bigger than the briefing had prepared them for. Each one stood on 6 armored legs with 2 heavy forelimbs that ended in serrated claws. Their heads were flat and eyeless, covered in sensory organs that twitched and turned toward the humans the moment they entered the room. The fight was brutal and close. The Crethon charged without warning or hesitation, scrambling across the floor, walls, and ceiling with terrifying speed. Jake's team opened fire and dropped the first wave, but more came flooding through openings in the walls. One of the creatures got close enough to swipe at a Marine named Pete Holt, tearing through his armor and opening a deep gash across his chest. Pete staggered back, looked down at the wound, and then raised his weapon and shot the creature in the head at point-blank range. They cleared the ship deck by deck, room by room. It took 4 hours. When they were done, Jake and his team stood in the central chamber of the carrier, surrounded by piles of dead Crethon, breathing hard and covered in dark alien blood. Pete Holt sat against a wall, with a field bandage pressed to his chest and a grin on his face that made him look slightly unhinged. Jake called in the report. The carrier was secured. Back on the bridge of the Iron Promise, Chris Dunn tallied the results. The battle had lasted 11 hours. The human fleet had destroyed over 300 Crethon vessels, including 4 carriers. The Copperhead had been damaged badly enough that she would need to be towed back for repairs. 7 Marines had been wounded during the boarding action, 2 of them seriously. But no human ships had been lost, and no humans had died. Rel stood quietly at the edge of the bridge, watching the humans work. He had seen coalition fleets of 50 ships destroyed by Crethon forces half this size. He had watched entire battle groups turn and flee at the first sign of the hive. And now, he had watched 4 human ships charge into 600 enemies and win. He did not understand these creatures. He did not think he ever would. But for the first time since the invasion began, he felt something he had almost forgotten. He felt hope. Chris Dunn did not share that feeling. He was already looking at the long-range scanners, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. The vanguard they had just fought was nothing. The main hive fleet was still coming, and it was 100 times larger than what they had just faced. 50,000 ships, billions of warriors, a living tide of destruction that would wash over Thessara and drown everything. He sent a message to Nate Bishop on Thessara. 2 words. Not enough. Nate read the message, closed his eyes, and began to plan for the end of the world. The sky above Thessara changed on the morning of the 6th day. The twin suns still shone, but their light seemed dimmer, as if something vast and dark had slipped between them and the surface of the world. The Velari who looked up saw it first. A shadow was spreading across the heavens, not like a cloud, but like a stain. It moved and shifted and pulsed, and as it grew larger, the people in the streets of the capital began to scream. The Crethon Hive Fleet had arrived. Nate Bishop stood in the command center that had been built beneath the Velari Council Hall. The room was cramped and filled with human equipment that had been bolted to the alien walls without any care for how it looked. Screens covered every surface, each one showing a different piece of the picture. Orbital feeds showed the Hive Fleet spreading across the sky like a living ceiling. Ground sensors tracked the first drop pods falling through the atmosphere, burning bright orange as they hit the thin air. Communication channels crackled with voices from every corner of the defense network. Nate had prepared for this. He had known from the moment he saw the intelligence data that the Hive Fleet would arrive on day 6. And he had used every hour of those 6 days to turn Thessara into something the Crethon had never encountered before. A world that would fight back. The orbital defense was thin but precise. Chris Dunn had brought the damaged Iron Promise back to Thessara, along with the remaining frigates, and positioned them in a tight net above the capital city. They were joined by a handful of coalition vessels that Nate had convinced to stay and fight instead of flee. It was not enough to stop the Hive Fleet. It was enough to make them pay for every kilometer of space they took. On the ground, Meg Lawson had turned the capital city into a fortress. She had spent 5 days digging trenches, building barricades, setting mines, and placing weapon positions in every building that had a good line of sight. The Valari had watched in confusion as the humans tore up their beautiful gardens and parks, and filled them with razor wire and buried explosives. Meg did not have time to explain that beauty would not stop the Crethon. Only violence would. Her force was a mix of 400 human marines and roughly 2,000 coalition volunteers. The volunteers had improved since the first day of training, but they were still soft by human standards. Meg had done her best. She had taught them how to hold a position, how to reload under fire, and most importantly, how to keep fighting when every part of their body was telling them to run. Whether they could actually do it under real conditions was a question that was about to be answered. The first Crethian drop pods hit the ground 3 kilometers outside the city. The impact shook the earth like a hammer blow. Each pod cracked open and spilled out dozens of warrior-caste Crethian, who immediately began to form up into columns and move toward the city at speed. More pods fell behind them, then more, then more. Within an hour, the plain outside the capital was covered in a dark, moving carpet of alien bodies stretching all the way to the horizon. Meg stood at the forward barricade and watched them come. She lifted her rifle, pressed the stock against her shoulder, and waited. The first wave hit the outer defense line like a wall of sound and fury. The Crethian did not use tactics. They simply charged, thousands of armored bodies crashing forward in a single mass. The mines buried in the ground detonated in sequence, tearing holes in the wave, but the gaps filled instantly. The humans opened fire. The kinetic rifles punched through the Crethon armor at close range, and the front of the wave collapsed into a pile of broken bodies. But the wave behind climbed over the dead and kept coming. The coalition volunteers on the left side of the line broke almost immediately. The sight of thousands of screaming alien predators charging directly at them was more than their gentle, sheltered minds could handle. They dropped their weapons and ran. Meg cursed and ordered a squad of Marines to cover the gap. The Marines moved into position and held the line with disciplined, measured fire, dropping Crethon after Crethon until the ground in front of them was piled waist-high with corpses. Dr. Laura Kim was in the command center with Nate, feeding intelligence to the front lines. She had spent days studying the Crethon pheromone communication system, the chemical signals that the Hive Queen used to coordinate her warriors. Laura had built a basic translation model that allowed her to predict the timing and direction of each attack wave roughly 30 seconds before it happened. It was not much, but in a battle this intense, 30 seconds was the difference between holding a position and being overrun. She called out a warning. The second wave was coming from the east, through a dry riverbed that led directly into the city center. Meg redirected her reserves and met the wave at the riverbed crossing with a wall of fire that turned the water into steam and the Crethon into ash. The battle raged for hours. The humans held their positions with a stubbornness that amazed and terrified the coalition observers. They did not retreat when the lines bent. They did not panic when the ammunition ran low. They fought with rifles, then with sidearms, then with knives, then with their bare hands. They fought because that was what humans did. They had been doing it since before they had language, since before they had fire, since the first of their ancestors picked up a rock and decided that the thing trying to eat them was going to have a very bad day. Sergeant Jake Perry's squad was holding a narrow street on the north side of the city when the ground beneath them erupted. The Crethon had tunneled under the defense line and burst up through the pavement in a shower of broken stone and alien bodies. Jake and his 12 Marines were suddenly surrounded, cut off from the rest of the force, with enemies pouring in from every direction. Jake did not hesitate. He grabbed a fallen piece of concrete, used it to smash the head of the nearest Crethon, and then rallied his squad into a tight circle in the middle of the street. They fought back to back, firing in every direction, stepping over the bodies of the dead to keep their footing. When their rifles ran dry, they switched to pistols. When their pistols ran dry, they used knives. When one Marine lost his knife, he picked up a severed Crethon limb and used it as a club. 9 hours. Jake Perry and his squad held that street for 9 hours. By the time a relief force of Marines fought through to reach them, the street was unrecognizable. It was a canyon of dead Crethon, piled so high that the buildings on either side were almost hidden. Jake was standing at the center of it, bleeding from cuts on his arms, legs, and face, holding an entrenching tool in both hands like a medieval knight with a sword. 3 of his Marines were down with serious injuries. The rest were on their feet, swaying with exhaustion, but alive. By the end of the 3rd day of fighting, the Crethon ground assault had stalled. They had thrown millions of warriors at the human defense lines, and millions of warriors had died. The streets of the capital were choked with alien dead. The Velari volunteers who had run at the first wave had slowly crept back to the lines over the following days, shamed by the sight of humans half their size holding positions that they had abandoned. Sorath, the young Velari who had asked Meg how humans ran toward death, was among them. He had picked up his weapon and returned to the barricade without a word. But the sky was a different story. In orbit, Chris Dunn was losing. The Hive fleet was simply too large. For every Crethan ship the Iron Promise destroyed, 10 more took its place. The cruiser had taken heavy damage. One of the frigates, the Sawtooth, had been destroyed. The orbital net was collapsing. And once it fell, the Crethon would be able to drop reinforcements directly into the city without opposition. Nate Bishop sat in the command center and stared at the tactical display for a long time. He could see the math. The ground defense could hold for days, maybe weeks, but without orbital control, it did not matter. The Crethon would simply bury them under bodies. There was one option. It was desperate, reckless, and almost certainly fatal. But Nate had studied the Hive Queen's communication network, and Laura had confirmed his theory. The entire Crethon species was controlled by a single mind. Kill the Queen, and the Hive would collapse into chaos. The Queen was aboard the largest ship in the fleet, a massive flagship at the center of the formation, protected by thousands of escort vessels. Nate picked up the comm and called Meg Lawson. He told her what he needed. Then Meg said, "I'll need volunteers." Jake Perry, standing nearby with bandages wrapped around both arms, said, "No, you won't. I'm coming." The assault shuttle was small, ugly, and built to survive things that would tear a normal ship apart. It had no weapons. It had no comfort. It was a box of armored steel, with an engine strapped to the back, and barely enough room inside for the 16 Marines who climbed aboard in the hangar of a coalition support vessel, hidden behind Thessera's largest moon. Meg Lawson stood at the front of the shuttle and looked at her team. They were bruised, bandaged, and running on nothing but stimulants and stubbornness. Jake Perry sat near the door with his left arm in a sling and a rifle balanced across his knees. He had refused to let the medics put him under for proper treatment. He said he would sleep when this was over. The rest of the team were Marines who had volunteered without hesitation, every one of them knowing that the odds of coming back alive were almost zero. Meg had never been good at speeches. She told them the plan in simple words. The shuttle would fly through the debris field left by 3 days of orbital fighting, using the wreckage of destroyed ships as cover to hide from the Crethon sensors. Chris Dunn and the Iron Promise would create a gap in the enemy formation by driving straight at the largest Crethon carrier in the fleet. Once the gap opened, the shuttle would punch through and make for the Queen's flagship. They would breach the hull, fight their way to the Queen, and blow her up with the shaped charges packed into every spare inch of the shuttle. She did not tell them it was a suicide mission. She did not need to. They could all do the math. The shuttle launched at 0200 hours, sliding out of the hangar in silence and drifting into the vast graveyard of broken ships that surrounded Thessara. The debris field was enormous. Pieces of human frigates floated alongside the torn remains of Crethon bioships. Frozen bodies drifted in the dark, both alien and human, spinning slowly in the starlight. The shuttle threaded through it all, with its engines barely above idle, moving like a ghost through a battlefield that was still warm. Above them, the final act of the orbital battle began. Chris Dunn brought the Iron Promise around in a wide arc and pointed her bow directly at the largest Crethon carrier in the formation. The carrier was a monster, nearly 2 kilometers long, its hull covered in thick biological armor and bristling with acid projectors. It sat in the center of the fleet, like a fat spider in a web of smaller ships. Chris opened a channel to his crew. He told them that he was going to do something very stupid and very necessary. He told them that escape pods would launch in 60 seconds, and that he expected every person on the ship to be in one. He told them it had been the honor of his life to serve with them, and he told them to go. The crew of the Iron Promise did not want to leave. They argued, they shouted, some of them cursed, but Chris had given an order, and in the end, they obeyed. Escape pods burst from the sides of the cruiser like seeds from a dying flower, scattering into the debris field, where coalition rescue ships were waiting to collect them. Chris Dunn sat alone on the bridge of the Iron Promise and pushed the engines to full power. The cruiser surged forward, her damaged hull groaning under the acceleration. Warning lights painted the empty bridge in red. The Crethon carrier saw her coming and began to turn, but the Iron Promise was already too close. Chris watched the carrier fill the view screen, growing from a distant shape to a wall of dark flesh that blocked out the stars. He closed his eyes and thought of home. A small house with a porch, a dog that liked to sleep in the sun. A life he might have had. The Iron Promise hit the carrier at full speed. The reinforced prow punched through the biological hull like a bullet through flesh, driving deep into the body of the alien vessel. The explosion was massive, a white flash that lit up the entire battlefield and sent shockwaves rippling through the Crethon formation. The carrier broke apart, and the ships around it scattered in confusion, opening a gap in the defensive ring around the Queen's flagship. Meg saw the gap and shouted for the pilot to go. The shuttle's engine fired at maximum thrust, and they shot forward through the opening like a dart through a closing door. Crethon drones tried to intercept, but the shuttle was small and fast, and the debris from the carrier's destruction provided cover. They made it through. The Queen's flagship was unlike anything Meg had ever seen. It was not a ship in any normal sense. It was a living mountain, a vast organic structure that pulsed and breathed, its surface covered in a network of veins that glowed a faint sickly green. The shuttle hit the hull at speed and punched through the outer membrane, crashing to a stop in a wide, wet corridor deep inside the organism. Meg kicked open the hatch and stepped out into hell. The air inside the flagship was thick and hot, filled with a chemical fog that burned the lungs even through the filters in their helmets. The walls moved, contracting and expanding in a slow rhythm, like the inside of a giant chest. The floor was soft and uneven, covered in a membrane that stuck to their boots with every step. And the sound was terrible, a deep, constant vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the heartbeat of something impossibly large. They moved fast. The Queen would know they were here, and every Guardian drone on the ship would be coming for them. The first Guardians appeared within minutes. They were bigger than the warriors on the ground, nearly twice the size, with thicker armor and longer claws. They moved through the corridors with a speed that seemed impossible for their size, their flat heads turning toward the humans with mechanical precision. The fight was savage. The Marines fired in controlled bursts, dropping the Guardians one at a time, but more kept coming, pouring out of openings in the walls and ceiling. A Marine named Sam Harding was pulled off his feet by a Guardian that dropped from above and dragged into a side tunnel. His screams lasted only a few seconds. Another Marine, a woman named Katie Bell, took an acid hit to her leg and kept fighting from the floor until Jake Perry pulled her behind cover. They lost people with every corridor they passed. 8 Marines became 6, then 4. Jake Perry held a narrow junction alone, while the rest of the team moved forward, standing in the center of the passage and firing into the endless stream of Guardians that came at him from both directions. He was hit twice, once in the shoulder and once across the ribs, and he did not move. He held that junction for 6 minutes, which was exactly the time Meg needed to reach the Queen's chamber. Meg blew the door with a breaching charge and stepped inside. The chamber was enormous. It was a hollow space the size of a cathedral, lit by the green glow of the veins that covered every surface. At the center, connected to the walls by hundreds of thick, pulsing tubes, was the Queen. She was vast, a pale, bloated organism the size of a building, her body fused with the ship itself. She had no eyes, no face, no features that Meg could recognize as belonging to a living thing. She was just mass, and hunger, and the cold intelligence that controlled billions of bodies across the stars. Meg felt the Queen notice her. It was not a sound or a movement. It was a pressure inside her skull, a sudden awareness of something ancient and enormous, turning its attention toward her, like a searchlight sweeping across a dark field. For one terrible moment, Meg felt the Queen try to push into her mind, to break her will the way she broke the will of every other species she encountered. But Meg Lawson was a human being. She came from a world where everything was trying to kill everything else, where survival was earned in blood and pain every single day. Her ancestors had faced down predators with nothing but sharpened sticks. Her people had walked through fire, ice, plague, and famine, and come out the other side still swinging. She was afraid. She was more afraid than she had ever been in her life. And she moved anyway. She armed the charges, planted them at the base of the Queen's body, and ran. The explosion ripped through the flagship like a thunderclap. The Queen died in a single moment, her vast body torn apart by fire and force. And across the battlefield, across the surface of Thesara, across every system the Crethan had invaded, the Hive felt it. Every warrior, every drone, every ship froze at the same instant, their connection to the central mind severed like a puppet's strings cut all at once. They shuddered, they stumbled, and then they collapsed into blind, mindless chaos, attacking each other, flying into asteroids, running in circles on the ground. Nate Bishop saw it happen on the tactical display. The red cloud of enemy markers broke apart like glass hitting a stone floor. He stood up, took a breath, and gave the order. All forces, full counterattack, push them out. The human fleet and the remaining coalition ships surged forward. The Marines on the ground charged out of their positions and drove into the confused, leaderless Crethan like wolves into a scattered flock. It was over in hours. The Hive fleet broke and fled into deep space, its remnants scattering in every direction. In the days that followed, the search and rescue teams worked through the wreckage above Thesara. They found Chris Dunn in the shattered remains of the Iron Promises Bridge, trapped under a collapsed bulkhead. He was broken badly, with fractures in his spine, his legs, and half the bones in his chest. But he was breathing. The medics said it was impossible. Chris told them, through a mask of blood and pain, that he was too stubborn to die. Jake Perry was found in the corridor of the Queen's flagship, sitting against a wall, with his rifle across his lap, and his eyes closed. He had lost his left arm below the elbow. When the medics woke him up, the first thing he said was that he was right-handed anyway, so it was not a big deal. Meg Lawson was buried under 3 meters of collapsed organic material near the Queen's chamber. It took the rescue team 4 hours to dig her out. She had a collapsed lung, 4 broken ribs, and a concussion that would keep her in bed for weeks. When they pulled her free, she was grinning. Ambassador Lorath came to the human field hospital the next day. He walked through the rows of wounded Marines, looking at their bandaged bodies and tired faces, and he stopped at Nate Bishop's bedside. Nate had not been injured. He was simply sitting there, exhausted, watching over his people. Lorath asked him how Earth could produce beings like this, how a single world could create people willing to fly into the heart of a monster and tear it apart from the inside. Nathan looked at the old alien for a long time. Then he said that Earth was not kind to its children, that every human alive was the descendant of someone who had survived something that should have killed them, that the Valeri had built their civilization by escaping danger, and humans had built theirs by turning around and fighting it. You looked at the universe and saw something to understand, Nate said. We looked at it and saw something to survive. Lorath was quiet for a long time. Then he extended his hand, a gesture he had learned from studying human customs. Nate took it and held it gently, careful not to squeeze too hard. The Galactic Coalition formally invited humanity to join as a full member the following week. The vote was unanimous. No one objected. No one ever would again. And somewhere, on a small blue world orbiting an ordinary star, a world of crushing gravity and poisonous air and endless beautiful violence, the people of Earth looked up at the sky and knew that they were no longer alone. They had been called and they had answered. That was what Deathworlders did.